Some of them say your record is sexist and possibly racist. What do you say about that?
The next one's going to be more racist and more sexist, and it's going to be a whole bunch better.
The voice didn't sound real. When people first heard it, many thought it was a joke. Some thought it was a demo mistake. Others asked the same question in disbelief. Is that really Mick Jagger? That high, almost cartoonish falsetto didn't just shock fans, it unsettled the band itself. Because Emotional Rescue wasn't supposed to sound like this, and yet, somehow, it did. Behind that strange voice was a band under pressure from every direction. Public outrage, creative exhaustion, personal collapse, and a quiet war between two men who no longer trusted each other. By the time the Rolling Stones entered the studio to record Emotional Rescue, they were coming off one of the biggest comebacks of their career. Some Girls had made them relevant again, but success didn't bring peace. It made everything worse. Relationships were ending, addictions were mutating, control over the band was being questioned for the first time in years. And instead of pulling together, the Stones were slowly drifting apart emotionally, creatively, and philosophically. This album isn't remembered for saving the Rolling Stones. It's remembered because it shows how close they were to breaking. And the strangest part? Most people never noticed. Before we continue, if you love the stories of Mick Jagger and Rolling Stones and want to help keep his legacy alive, subscribe to this channel. By 1978, Some Girls had done the impossible. It silenced critics, dominated charts, and made the Rolling Stones dangerous again. In the United States, it became their best-selling album to date. The backlash accusations of sexism and cultural insensitivity didn't hurt them, it helped them. For Mick Jagger, controversy was oxygen. When pressed about the criticism, he didn't retreat. He doubled down, he joked, he provoked. And in doing so, he reinforced something crucial. The Stones were still relevant because they refused to apologize. But success created a new problem: power. For nearly a decade, Mick had quietly become the band's unquestioned decision-maker. Tours, schedules, branding, business, it all ran through him. And while Keith Richards was battling addiction, that arrangement went largely unchallenged. Now, that was changing. The band looked unified on the surface, but internally, lines were being drawn. Personal lives were unraveling. Trust was thinning. And the momentum of Some Girls created pressure to move fast to release another album before the moment disappeared. That urgency would define Emotional Rescue, not as a carefully planned artistic statement, but as a reaction, a response to noise, criticism, and fear of losing control. And at the center of it all were two men who no longer saw the future the same way. For the first time in nearly 10 years, Keith Richards was present. He was no longer consumed by chasing fixes or dodging courtrooms. After serious legal trouble in Canada, he made a real attempt to clean up, and with that clarity came something new: a voice. Keith began involving himself in decisions he had ignored for years: release schedules, touring plans, long-term strategy. To him, the Rolling Stones were more than hits, they were a legacy that needed protection. Mick didn't see it that way. Mick had built the band's modern survival on adaptability. Disco, punk, funk, he followed trends not because he believed in them, but because he knew how quickly relevance vanished. And he wasn't interested in sharing that control. The tension wasn't explosive yet. It was cold, professional, sharp. According to people close to the band, Mick later admitted something unsettling that Keith had been easier to deal with when he was struggling, because now he was asking questions, pushing back, challenging authority. Journalists would later call this period Stones World War II. It didn't start with screaming matches. It started with decisions, and it would shape everything that followed, especially the sound of the next record. Mick Jagger believed movement was everything. If people couldn't dance to a song, it failed no matter how clever it was. That belief pushed him deeper into disco, funk, and rhythm-driven music as the 1,970 seconds came to an end. For Emotional Rescue, Mick leaned in harder than ever. The grooves became simpler, the beats more repetitive, and then came the vocals. That falsetto wasn't an accident, it was intentional. A calculated risk to place the Stones inside a sound dominating clubs and radio. Inside the band, reactions were mixed at best. Charlie Watts disliked disco's mechanical feel but played what was needed. Bill Wyman continued drifting away, focusing on solo projects without confrontation. Ronnie Wood stayed neutral, enthusiastic, refusing to take sides. Keith hated it. To him, the falsetto crossed a line. It flirted with parody. It sounded unnatural. Worse, it sounded like the Stones chasing something they weren't. That fear haunted the sessions. Not the fear of failure, the fear of embarrassment. And while the music tried to sound carefree and rhythmic, the atmosphere around it was anything but. Because Paradise couldn't keep reality away for long. On paper, the setting couldn't have been better. The Rolling Stones relocated part of the emotional rescue sessions to Compass Point Studios in the Bahamas. Sunlight, ocean air, palm trees. A studio designed for comfort and escape. After months in Paris, it felt like relief. But Paradise didn't calm the band. It only exposed the cracks. The move wasn't just about atmosphere. There were practical reasons, financial ones. Recording outside France reduced tax pressure, and the Bahamas offered privacy from press and scrutiny. Yet the emotional baggage came with them. Keith stayed behind longer than the others, working obsessively. Mick moved freely between studios, always focused on momentum. Charlie remained professional and distant. Bill Wyman was already half removed, present but disengaged. What should have been a fresh start became fragmented. Sessions felt disjointed. Songs were started, abandoned, and resumed without clarity. Decisions were made quickly, often without consensus. The urgency to release another record while Some Girls was still hot pushed the band forward before they were ready. This wasn't careful craftsmanship. It was controlled damage. And inside that chaos, something unexpected happened. The most honest songs on the album weren't written by Mick. They came from Keith, and they weren't subtle. On Emotional Rescue, the tension didn't explode. It leaked. She's So Cold came together fast, almost too fast. Mick reportedly wrote it in under an hour. The lyrics painted emotional distance, frustration, obsession. The irony was impossible to ignore. A man chasing connection while everything around him felt unreachable. The single failed to chart as expected, especially in the UK. For the first time in years, the Stones tasted public indifference again. That stung. But the most revealing moment came later. All About You didn't sound like a Rolling Stones song. It sounded wounded, slow, bitter. Keith's voice cracked through the melody, carrying resentment that felt personal. Keith would later say no song is ever about just one thing, but listeners didn't miss the subtext. The fractured relationship in the lyrics mirrored his reality with Anita, with Mick, with the band itself. This wasn't protest music. It was exhaustion. Critics later called it one of the strongest tracks on the album because it felt real, unpolished, uncomfortable. A glimpse of what the Stones rarely allowed the public to see. While Mick pushed forward, Keith was quietly unraveling. And outside the studio, something far darker was unfolding. By 1979, Keith Richards' personal life had become unbearable. Anita Pallenberg, once the magnetic center of his world, was spiraling. Her behavior grew erratic, volatile, and destructive. Their home environment became unpredictable, tense, and unsafe. Keith later described living in constant fear, not just for himself, but for his children. The breaking point came during an incident that would haunt everyone involved. A young man associated with Anita was involved in a tragic, self-inflicted incident involving a firearm. Keith wasn't present. His son was. The trauma that followed ended any remaining illusion of stability. Authorities became involved. Charges were reduced. Consequences were minimal, but the damage was permanent. Keith removed his son from the situation and left for good. This wasn't just the end of a relationship. It was the collapse of a world Keith had tried and failed to save. Inside the band, no one wanted to talk about it. The album moved forward. The schedule didn't slow, but something had shifted. Keith was now clean from heroin, but replacing one dependency with another. Alcohol and cocaine filled the space. The emotional weight followed him into every session. And Emotional Rescue, for all its upbeat rhythms, now carried a shadow no groove could hide. When recording wrapped, the conflict didn't end. It intensified. Mick and Keith flew to New York to begin mixing Emotional Rescue, and that's where the disagreements became unavoidable. Every decision turned into a debate. Levels, vocals, groove, direction. Mick wanted clarity, polish, and hits. Keith wanted grit, restraint, and identity. To Keith, the falsetto-heavy tracks and dance-oriented sound felt like a step too far. He feared the Stones were bending themselves to trends that wouldn't last. Mick, on the other hand, believed refusing to adapt was the real danger. Neither backed down. Then Mick did something that felt unforgivable to Keith. He stepped away. While the album was still unresolved, Mick shifted his focus to acting, leaving New York to join the chaotic production of Fitzcarraldo in South America. The shoot was infamous, brutal conditions, accidents, delays, and constant instability. Keith felt abandoned. To him, this wasn't just about music, it was about responsibility. The band was fragile, emotionally and creatively, and Mick had chosen to leave. Mixing stalled, communication deteriorated, resentment deepened, and for the first time, the Rolling Stones felt like a business partnership teetering on the edge of collapse. While the band fractured internally, the image presented to the world told a different story. The cover of Emotional Rescue was striking. Thermographic photographs captured the band not through light, but heat glowing, abstract, futuristic. It suggested innovation, reinvention, control. It was intentional. By returning to the designer who had worked on Some Girls, Mick ensured visual continuity. The message was clear. The Stones weren't looking back, they were evolving. But the irony was sharp. Behind the sleek, modern imagery was a band barely holding itself together. Communication had broken down, trust was thin, the future was uncertain. The artwork wasn't deception, it was aspiration. A way of projecting unity while privately navigating division. And when the album finally arrived in June 1980, the illusion worked. Emotional Rescue hit #1 in both the US and the UK. The last Stones album to achieve that feat had been released 7 years earlier. Commercially, it was a triumph. Critically, it was complicated. Some praised its boldness, others called it inconsistent. Many felt it lacked the raw urgency that had revitalized the band just 2 years earlier. Keith, especially, walked away unsatisfied. On the surface, Emotional Rescue looked like a success. Chart-topping sales, global attention, a band that, once again, proved it could survive changing times. But inside the Rolling Stones, something fundamental had changed. This album marked the end of compromise. Keith had reached his limit with chasing trends. Disco, falsetto vocals, and dance-driven experiments would not define the Stones going forward. He pushed hard for a return to roots, guitars, groove, and raw emotion. This time, Mick listened. By the next album, the shift was unmistakable. No disco, no falsetto, no attempts to follow the moment. Tattoo. You would sound like the Rolling Stones again, not because trends had faded, but because the band had finally chosen identity over survival tactics. Emotional Rescue wasn't about love. It wasn't about dance floors. It wasn't even about success. It was about control. About how close the Rolling Stones came to breaking and how they learned, painfully, where the line was. If this story changed how you see the Stones, this is the kind of deep dive we do here. Subscribe, like the video, and comment below. Do you think Mick saved the band by adapting, or did Keith save it by pulling them back? Because sometimes, survival sounds nothing like harmony. Emotional Rescue was never meant to save the Rolling Stones. It was a warning. A moment when success hit exhaustion, when rhythm covered fear, and when a band learned that survival sometimes costs more than failure. They didn't break that time, but they came close enough to hear it. And once you hear that sound, you never make music the same way again.